On a quiet afternoon in a small American town, a trembling little girl picked up the phone and whispered to 911, "He put Mama under the floor." What the police discovered next would change not only her life, but the entire town forever. This is a story of courage, of a loyal German shepherd who refused to leave her side, and of a community learning the cost of silence. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. And may your day be filled with peace and blessings. The late afternoon sun of Willow Creek cast a honeyed glow across the quiet streets. A small town nestled among rolling hills and patches of pine forest in rural Oregon. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth after a morning drizzle, and the storefronts along Main Street glimmered faintly in the waning light, as though trying to forget that autumn was slowly giving way to the cold bite of winter. It was 3:47 p.m. when the emergency call came through, shattering the calm. Officer Ethan Rose sat at his cluttered desk in the modest police station at the edge of town, finishing paperwork that seemed endless. At 35 years old, Ethan cut the figure of a man shaped both by discipline and by old scars. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his build still carrying the ruggedness of years of physical labor before he joined the academy. His brown hair, cropped short, was just beginning to silver at the temples, and his hazel eyes had a depth that spoke more of endurance than ease. There was a faint line along his jaw, a scar from a bar fight long ago when he was 19, and it carried with it a story of temper and loss he had long since buried. Ethan was known in Willow Creek as a fair but distant figure, respected yet rarely understood. Those who saw him at the diner might notice he never laughed too freely, that his smile was always quick to fade, like it belonged to someone else. His colleagues admired his reliability, but they whispered of his solitude, his avoidance of personal ties, the way his life seemed tethered to duty alone. The crackle of the radio pierced the stillness of the office. Dispatch's voice carried urgency. "Unit 23, we have a child on the line. She sounds distressed. 412 Maple Street. Please respond immediately." Ethan's pulse quickened. Calls involving children were different. They cut through his armor like a blade. In his 8 years on the force, nothing unsettled him more. He grabbed his keys, his leather jacket, and strode out the door, boots heavy against the worn linoleum floor. The drive across town was brief, barely 4 minutes. But the weight in Ethan's chest stretched every second into an eternity. He had grown up not far from Maple Street, in a trailer that no longer stood, and the memory of his childhood, raised voices, broken glass, the sound of his mother sobbing in the dark, crept up like a ghost riding shotgun beside him. When he arrived at the address, the small house looked tired, as though time itself had decided it was unworthy of repair. The white paint had peeled into thin curls, the garden was overgrown with weeds that tangled like wild hair, and the front door swayed gently on its hinges, open to the cool October breeze. Ethan parked his cruiser at the curb, his eyes narrowing. Something was wrong. He stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. His hand hovered near his holster as he called out, "Hello? This is Officer Rowe with Willow Creek. Police. Is anyone home?" No response, only the faint whistle of wind through the cracked eaves. Then, softer than a whisper, came the sound of crying. It pulled him forward, through the doorway, past the worn rug and faded wallpaper that smelled faintly of mildew. On the living room floor sat a child, no older than 7, her knees tucked into a fraying purple dress that might have once been vibrant but now sagged with wear. She had wide brown eyes that seemed too large for her face, eyes that shimmered with tears and terror alike. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks in damp strands, and her small hands pressed flat against the floorboards, as though holding on to something unseen. Beside her lay a German shepherd, perhaps 6 years old, his coat a striking blend of black and silver, his amber eyes fierce and alert. His ears pricked at Ethan's presence, and he gave a low, guarded growl before deciding this intruder was not a threat. The dog's name, as Ethan would later learn, was Ranger, and even in that first moment it was clear he had taken it upon himself to be both shield and sentinel for the fragile girl. Ranger's ribs showed faintly beneath his fur. He was lean, as if meals had been scarce, but his bearing was strong, protective, unwavering. He positioned himself between Ethan and the child at first, then eased slightly when he sensed the calm in Ethan's voice. Ethan knelt, lowering himself so as not to tower over the child. His voice softened. "Hey, sweetheart. Are you okay? I'm Ethan. You called for help, didn't you?" The girl's chin trembled as she raised her gaze to him. Her voice, small as moth wings, carried a weight that pressed on the air. He put Mama under the floor. She's been sleeping down there, and she won't wake up." The words landed in Ethan's chest like a blow. For an instant, the room shifted into a cruel echo of his past. Himself, at 8 years old, crouched under a bed, listening to his father's rage, powerless to stop what came next. He forced the image aside and looked at her more closely. "What's your name, honey?" His voice was steady, but inside, he braced himself for her answer. "Lila," she whispered. "Lila Brooks." She pointed at the floorboards beneath her, the boards that looked oddly different from the rest. Newer nails hammered in unevenly, a faint discoloration where wood met wood. Ethan's police instincts sharpened. Something was concealed here, but beyond the badge, something deeper stirred. A paternal ache, a call to shield the child before him. He glanced at Ranger, who pressed his muzzle to Lila's knee as if to comfort her. The bond between the girl and the dog was undeniable. This was no ordinary pet. This was her anchor in a storm no child should ever know. Ethan felt an unspoken kinship with Ranger, two protectors, worlds apart, united by the same vow. "Where's your daddy right now, Lila?" Ethan asked softly. Her small shoulders lifted in a helpless shrug. "I don't know. He left after he put Mama to sleep. He said she was tired for a long, long time." Ethan clenched his jaw. He reached into his wallet, drawing out a faded photograph he carried like a talisman. It showed a woman with gentle eyes and a tired smile, his mother long gone. He held it out where Lila could see. "This is my mama," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "She went to sleep when I was about your age. And you know what? I understand how scared you must be right now." Lila's teardrops stilled for a moment. She studied the photograph, then looked up at him with wonder. "Your mama went to sleep too?" "Yes," Ethan said. "And I want you to know something very important. None of this is your fault. Sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices, but children are never, ever to blame." Ranger wagged his tail faintly, as though he too understood. Ethan took out his radio, carefully requesting backup, child services, and forensics. But he did not move away from Lila. He stayed right there on the floor beside her, his knees pressing into the creaking wood. As the minutes stretched, Ethan began telling her stories about how he once had a dog, a scrappy mutt named Diesel, who guarded him like a knight when the nights grew loud. About how that loyalty carried him through until he became a police officer. He spoke not with authority, but with compassion, weaving fragments of his own survival into a tapestry Lila could cling to. Lila's sobs quieted. She leaned into Ranger's thick fur, whispering to him, "He'll help us." Then, suddenly, she turned to Ethan with a plea so raw it nearly broke him. "Officer Ethan, will you help me wake Mama up?" Ethan's breath caught. The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. He looked into her eyes, so young, so wounded, yet still clinging to hope, and felt something inside him shift irrevocably. He could not promise what she wanted, but he could promise something else. "Lila," he said gently, "I'm going to help you in every way I can. I'm not going anywhere." The wail of sirens approached in the distance, echoing through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. For the first time since stepping into that broken home, Ethan realized this wasn't just another call. This was the turning point of a life, not only for the child in front of him, but perhaps for himself as well. He looked again at the floorboards, then at Lila, then at Ranger standing guard. Whatever secrets lay beneath, he knew one thing with certainty. Lila would not face them alone. The sirens drew closer, their wail slicing through the quiet streets until the flashing lights painted the walls of Maple Street in red and blue. Ethan stayed crouched on the floorboards beside Lila, refusing to let the growing bustle drive a wedge between them. Ranger remained alert, tail still and ears upright, his protective stance unwavering. When the first car stopped outside, Ethan looked toward the door, but did not rise. He wanted Lila to see that even amid the uniformed strangers, He was anchored there with her. The first to step inside was Detective Sarah Mitchell, a woman of 32 whose presence carried both gentleness and gravity. She was tall and lean, with long legs that seemed to move with the precision of someone used to balancing authority with grace. Her hair, a soft chestnut brown, was tied back in a loose bun that revealed the stern set of her jaw. She wore a charcoal suit, slightly creased at the elbows, and a trench coat dampened by the drizzle outside. Her green eyes betrayed exhaustion. Dark circles whispered of nights spent poring over case files. But within that fatigue burned an unmistakable compassion. Sarah had joined the force after losing her younger sister to domestic violence at 16, a wound that shaped her every choice. It gave her the drive to intervene, but also the guilt that she had been too late once, and perhaps might always be too late again. "Officer Rowe," Sarah greeted softly, her voice careful not to startle the child. She lowered herself so her tall frame seemed less imposing, and addressed Lila with the gentleness of a teacher coaxing trust. "Sweetheart, my name is Sarah. We're here to help you, okay?" Lila clutched at Ranger's fur, eyes flicking between the woman and Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod of encouragement, and only then did Lila whisper, "She's under there." Sarah followed the girl's gaze to the uneven planks, her lips tightening. Behind her shuffled a man with a square face, broad shoulders, and a posture that spoke of decades bent over heavy lifting. This was Frank Donnelly, the forensic technician, nearing 50, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed close. He was methodical, slow to speak, and known in town as a man who'd rather measure twice than speak once. His work boots carried the scuffs of years spent on muddy crime scenes. Frank gave a curt nod to Ethan, then scanned the room, his eyes narrowing on the floorboards. "We'll need to section this off immediately," he muttered. Ethan rose at last, but only to stand behind Lila and Ranger, his presence still tethered to them. "Frank, just hold a moment. We're not moving anything until Child Services arrives. She needs stability right now." At that, a woman entered, Helen Winters, a neighbor from across the street. Though technically not part of the team, she had hurried in after seeing the flashing lights. Helen was in her late 60s, her silver hair tied back with a simple barrette, her frame short and softened by age. She had a face that had once been handsome, and was now etched with lines of kindness and regret. A widow, for nearly 2 decades, she lived alone in a house cluttered with porcelain figurines and old lace curtains. Known to every child on the street as Grandma Helen, she had a habit of handing out cookies and knitted mittens. Yet, as her gaze fell on Lila, her eyes welled with tears. "Oh, my poor girl," she whispered. She looked toward Ethan with a pained expression. "I should have done more. I knew something wasn't right, and I just baked cookies instead." Ethan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We'll talk, Helen. For now, she needs you calm." Helen nodded, wiping at her eyes, though guilt settled heavily across her features. Sarah crouched beside Lila again. "Honey, can you tell me your dog's name?" she asked softly. Lila stroked Ranger's head. "Ranger. He keeps me safe when Daddy's loud." The German shepherd shifted, pressing closer against Lila's side, his muscles tense as though ready to fend off unseen threats. Sarah offered a faint smile. "He's a brave one, just like you." Outside, radios crackled as more officers secured the property, stringing tape across the yard and marking the perimeter. Inside, the house felt like a capsule of silence, its faded curtains swaying slightly in the breeze that crept through the cracked door. Sarah glanced at Ethan, her brow furrowing. "New boards, recent nails. We both know what this means." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he refused to let his eyes stray too long from Lila. "We'll wait. I'm not tearing her world apart in front of her." As the minutes passed, Sarah gently guided Helen to take Lila to the porch for air. Ranger padded after them, unwilling to leave his post. Ethan stood by the doorway, watching Lila as she leaned against Helen's shoulder, her face pale but calmer than before. Helen smoothed the girl's hair with trembling hands. Ethan caught the sight and felt a pang. Helen's tenderness resembled what he'd wished for in his own childhood, a comfort that had never come. When Frank began preparing his equipment, Sarah laid a hand on his arm. "Not yet. Tonight she needs safety, not sawdust." Frank sighed, but conceded, stepping back. Ethan appreciated her restraint. Sarah might be new to Willow Creek, but she understood the delicate balance between truth and trauma. Helen spoke quietly to Ethan while Lila clutched Ranger outside. I used to hear them, nights when Caleb shouted so loud the windows rattled. Sometimes I thought of calling someone, but it's hard, you know? You don't want to pry into family matters. Ethan's gaze hardened, but he tempered his voice. You saw the bruises, didn't you? Helen nodded miserably. I gave her cookies. I told her to be brave. That was all I did. Not anymore, Ethan said firmly. She's not alone now. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the peeling paint of the Brooks house, Sarah gathered her notes, her eyes distant. Ethan could tell she was already building the case in her mind, weaving fragments into a net meant to catch the truth. But her shoulders carried more than the weight of this investigation. They bore the burden of her sister's memory, a tragedy she confessed once in hushed tones to a colleague. The night she had been away at college while her younger sister was beaten to death by a boyfriend no one suspected. That scar was why Sarah rarely allowed herself to rest. Ethan walked toward the porch, kneeling once more beside Lila. The girl had quieted, her head resting against Ranger's flank. The German shepherd's amber eyes glowed faintly in the dusk, his breathing steady as though telling her she was safe. Ethan laid a hand on the dog's thick fur. Good boy, he murmured. Lila looked up at him, voice small but steady. You won't leave us, right? Ethan met her gaze squarely. No, Lila, I'm not going anywhere. The promise hung in the cooling air, solid as iron. The flashing lights still painted the street outside, but within the fragile circle formed by a grieving child, a loyal dog, an old neighbor, and 2 officers bound by wounds of the past, something resolute was born. A determination to protect what remained, to uncover what lay beneath the whispering floorboards. Night settled slowly over Willow Creek, the horizon awash with streaks of crimson, fading into indigo. The last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the pines, and the air grew sharp with the crisp bite of autumn. Inside the Brooks house, the hum of radios and the measured footsteps of investigators filled the silence that had earlier seemed unbearable. Yet, in the small living room, where Lila had cried against the floorboards, a fragile bubble of stillness remained, held together by the presence of Ethan, Ranger, and the little girl whose world had just begun to unravel. Ethan sat cross-legged beside Lila on the worn carpet, his tall frame bent slightly so that his hazel eyes were level with hers. The child clutched Ranger's thick neck, her cheek pressed into his black and silver fur, as though it were a pillow that could guard against nightmares. Ranger, steady and unflinching, rested his head across her knees, his amber eyes half-lidded, yet always alert. His ears flicked with every sound, the click of a flashlight, the distant murmur of Sarah's voice as she conferred with Frank in the kitchen. But his body never moved away from the girl. Detective Sarah Mitchell had returned from a call outside, her trench coat brushing against the doorframe as she stepped back into the room. She crouched down beside Ethan, her green eyes searching his expression. There was weariness in her features, the kind that came from years of balancing compassion against the weight of tragedy. We've secured the perimeter, she murmured, keeping her voice low so as not to startle Lila. Child Services is on their way, but traffic on Route 16 is slow. Could be another 40 minutes. Ethan gave a terse nod. He had no intention of letting Lila wait alone in the meantime. Sarah glanced at the girl, her heart tugged by the way Lila's small fingers tangled in Ranger's fur. She trusts him, she whispered. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the dog. She trusts him because he hasn't left her side. That's what matters. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. She remembered her own sister clutching a stuffed rabbit, waiting for Sarah to come home from college the night tragedy struck. The memory left a permanent hollow she filled with work, but never with peace. Ethan leaned slightly closer to Lila. Hey, sweetheart, he said gently. You want to know a secret? The girl blinked up at him, curiosity dimming her fear for a moment. When I was your age, I had a dog too. Not as noble as Ranger. He was scrappy, his ears never stood up straight, and he smelled like he'd rolled in the creek every day. His name was Diesel Ethan, chuckled faintly, the sound rough but genuine. Diesel used to sleep right outside my door when things got bad. I knew that as long as he was there, I wasn't alone. Lila tilted her head, considering his words. Did he keep you safe when your daddy was loud? She asked softly, her voice cracking on the word daddy. Ethan's breath caught. The question sliced through years of silence he had wrapped around his childhood. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening before he answered. Yes, he did. And when I grew up, I promised myself I'd try to keep other kids safe too. That's why I wear this uniform. Sarah's eyes flicked toward Ethan, surprised by the openness in his tone. He rarely spoke of himself. Even in the department, he was known as a man who carried his secrets close to the vest. She saw now that the child had unlocked something in him that no one else had. The living room door opened softly, and a tall man entered carrying a large canvas bag. Dr. Leonard Hale, the town physician who often assisted with crisis calls, had arrived. In his early 60s, Dr. Hale was lean, with angular features that made him look perpetually stern, though his eyes revealed a kindness that softened the impression. His silver hair was combed neatly back, and his wire-rimmed glasses reflected the glow of the overhead light. Leonard had been practicing in Willow Creek for over 30 years, and though arthritis had stiffened his hands, his calm demeanor remained a source of comfort for many. "Evening," he said gently, setting down the bag. His voice was deep, resonant, carrying authority without edge. "I came to check on the girl." Ethan moved slightly aside to let him kneel near Lila. The doctor smiled faintly. "Hello, Lila. I'm Dr. Hale. I won't hurt you, I promise. I just want to see if you're feeling okay." Lila leaned tighter into Ranger, clearly reluctant. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's a good man, Lila. He's here to help." Dr. Hale kept his movements slow, producing a small penlight. He gently checked Lila's pupils, her pulse, her breathing. "She's shaken, but no immediate injuries," he murmured to Ethan. Then his eyes caught Ranger's lean frame. "That dog of hers could use a decent meal, though." He smiled at the German shepherd, who regarded him with cautious amber eyes, ears flicking but body still. "Strong fellow, loyal too." Helen Winters, still lingering in the doorway, wrung her hands together. "I can bring them both food," she offered, her voice quivering. "I still have stew on the stove." Her simple frame looked frailer under the harsh light, her age more pronounced in her hunched posture. Guilt seemed to etch deeper lines into her face, but her kindness held steady. "Thank you, Helen," Sarah said gently. "That might be exactly what we need right now." As Helen bustled off toward her house across the street, Sarah sat carefully on the floor near Lila. "You know," she began softly, "I once had a little sister your age. She was brave like you. She liked to braid my hair and tell me stories. I think she would have liked you very much." Her voice wavered for a fraction of a second before she steadied it. "And you, remind me of her courage." Lila blinked, surprised. She glanced at Ethan, then at Sarah. Slowly she whispered, "Do you think Mama will be proud of me?" Ranger lifted his head, pressing his nose gently into her hand as if to nudge her toward strength. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "I know she already is," he said. "You were brave enough to call for help. That takes more courage than most grown-ups I know." At that moment, Helen returned with a tray, 2 bowls of steaming stew, and a plate with thick slices of bread. The scent of herbs filled the room. "Here," she said softly, kneeling to set the tray near the girl. Lila hesitated, then, encouraged by Ethan's nod, took a spoonful. Ranger sat dutifully by her side, tail thumping softly against the floor, when Helen set down a smaller bowl filled with scraps for him. The dog ate slowly, never straying far from Lila's hand. Time passed quietly. The living room bathed in the soft light of a single lamp. Outside, the chatter of radios and the shuffle of officers continued. But within these walls, there was an unusual peace. For the first time since Ethan had arrived, Lila no longer looked like a child lost in terror. She looked like a child who had found, at least for the moment, a circle of guardians. As Dr. Hale packed his bag, he leaned toward Ethan. "She'll need consistent care. Trauma this deep doesn't fade quickly. But tonight, you've done right by her." Ethan only nodded, his eyes fixed on the girl. Sarah gathered her notes, her jaw firming. She glanced at the uneven floorboards once more, the boards that seemed to hum with secrets, and then at Ethan. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we dig." Ethan's gaze lingered on Lila, who had fallen asleep against Ranger's flank, her hand still buried in his fur. He nodded once, his expression solemn. Tomorrow. But tonight, she rests. Dawn crept into Willow Creek with the chill of late October. The morning fog lay heavy across the streets, curling low around the rooftops like a blanket reluctant to lift. The Brooks house stood muted in the gray light, its peeling paint and crooked shutters even starker beneath the pale sky. Police tape fluttered gently in the breeze, its yellow stark against the stillness. Ethan Rose stepped out of his cruiser, stretching his broad shoulders as if shaking off the fatigue of a night where sleep had been impossible. His hazel eyes were shadowed, but his stride carried quiet determination. Today, the secrets beneath the floor would come to light. Inside, the team gathered. Detective Sarah Mitchell, her tall figure wrapped in a fitted navy coat, studied the uneven planks of the living room floor. Her sharp green eyes looked more alive in daylight, but the faint dark circles beneath them betrayed another sleepless night. Sarah was not one to waste words in the morning. Her posture, rigid yet graceful, said enough. Beside her stood Frank Donnelly, the seasoned forensic technician, his square frame hunched slightly as he inspected his equipment. He wore a thick flannel shirt under his jacket, and the lines at the corners of his mouth deepened as he muttered about protocols. Ethan's gaze flicked to Lila. The girl had spent the night at Helen Winters' house, across the street, where warmth and homemade quilts shielded her from the cold of truth. Now she sat at the kitchen table, with Ranger pressed faithfully at her side. Her purple dress had been exchanged for jeans and a simple sweater Helen had found in a storage trunk. A garment too big for her, but smelling faintly of lavender. Ranger, his black and silver coat gleaming faintly in the muted light, stood alert, occasionally nudging her with his nose, as if reminding her he was still there. Helen herself bustled in with a tray of warm biscuits, her short, stout frame wrapped in a knitted cardigan. Her silver hair, slightly disheveled, glowed in the morning light. She didn't sleep much, Helen whispered to Ethan, worry softening her lined face. Every sound had her clutching that dog. Ethan nodded, grateful but heavy-hearted. As the forensics team prepared to lift the planks, a new figure entered. Deputy Mark Hensley, a man in his early 40s, built solid like a former farmhand. His sandy hair was cropped close, and his brown eyes were steady, though they carried a hint of unease at what they might uncover. Known in town as dependable but sometimes hesitant, Mark had joined the sheriff's department after losing his own brother in a car crash years ago, a loss that left him with a fear of failing others. He adjusted his belt nervously, then greeted Ethan with a firm handshake. "Morning, ready as I'll ever be." The work began slowly. Frank directed the officers as they carefully loosened nails and pried up the boards, each movement deliberate, the wood creaking as though reluctant to surrender its truth. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and mildew rising from beneath. Ethan stood with his arms folded, his jaw tight, his gaze flicking between Lila, whom Helen held close, and the gaping hole emerging in the floor. Ranger let out a low growl, his body tense, as if he already knew. The first reveal was not a body, but evidence, tattered cloth, dark stains embedded in the soil, strands of auburn hair caught in the splintered wood. Sarah crouched, her green eyes narrowing as she carefully bagged each fragment. Her hands, steady despite the weight of the moment, moved with a precision born from both training and grief long carried. She glanced briefly at Ethan, her lips pressing together. "This confirms it." Ethan's stomach churned, but he remained composed. He turned to where Lila stood in the doorway, Helen's arm wrapped tightly around her small shoulders. "Let's take her outside," Ethan said softly. Helen nodded, guiding the girl toward the porch. Ranger padded after them, his tail rigid, his eyes fixed on the hole as though unwilling to turn his back. As Lila stepped onto the porch, she whispered something Ethan caught only faintly. "Mama's in there." Ranger pressed against her side, amber eyes burning with a protective fire that no human could replicate. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that maybe it wasn't so, but he couldn't lie. The boards, the hair, the stains, they all spoke the truth she already knew. Outside, Sarah joined them after issuing instructions to Frank. She crouched beside Lila, her tall frame folding gracefully until her eyes were level with the child's. "You're very brave," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of a sisterly promise. "This is not your fault. and we will take care of you." Lila's lips trembled, but she reached down to hold Ranger's ear, grounding herself. Meanwhile, Helen fussed with a shawl, draping it over Lila's shoulders. "Come on, love, let's get you warm." The older woman's face, though lined with years, radiated an earnest desire to mend what she could, even if she knew some wounds would never fully close. Deputy Mark stepped out onto the porch, his face pale. He removed his hat, running a calloused hand through his cropped hair. "We'll be continuing the dig tomorrow with heavier equipment. The soil's dense, but it's clear enough what happened here." His words hung heavy in the crisp morning air. Sarah's jaw tightened, her green eyes flashing with controlled fury. She turned slightly toward Ethan. "This isn't just a tragedy, it's a crime scene that's been neglected for far too long." Ethan said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw twitched. He knew she was right. Helen led Lila back into her own home across the street, Ranger trotting faithfully beside them. Inside, Helen's warm kitchen, filled with the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee, Lila sat at the table clutching a mug of cocoa Helen had pressed into her hands. Ranger lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his gaze ever watchful. Helen stroked Lila's hair, whispering reassurances, her own eyes shimmering with guilt. Ethan lingered at the window, watching across the street as the forensic team secured the Brooks house for the night. His reflection in the glass showed the lines of weariness etched into his face. He thought of his own childhood home, the shouting, the fear, and the silence of neighbors who looked away. He swore silently that Lila would not be left to the same silence. The day ended not with closure, but with confirmation. Something terrible had happened beneath those floorboards, and though the work of uncovering it was far from over, the first pieces of truth had surfaced. Ethan turned back toward Helen's kitchen, where Lila's small frame leaned against the sturdy body of her German shepherd. Ranger lifted his head at Ethan's approach, his amber eyes gleaming as though demanding a vow. Ethan gave it silently. No matter what was uncovered tomorrow, the child would not face it alone. The following morning arrived cold and unyielding, the sky above Willow Creek washed in a pale steel gray, as though the town itself anticipated the weight of revelations still to come. Overnight, frost had painted the lawns white, crunching beneath boots as officers came and went around the Brooks residence. The yellow tape now sagged with dew, cordoning off the house that had turned into the epicenter of suspicion. Ethan Rose stood near the porch railing of Helen Winters' home, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee Helen had pressed into them. He had not slept, and the hollowness in his hazel eyes betrayed it. But there was a clarity in his expression, too. He would see this through, however long it took. Inside Helen's warm kitchen, Lila sat bundled in a too-large cardigan, the sleeves covering her small hands as she leaned against Ranger. The German shepherd had become her shadow. His thick black and silver coat caught the glow of the fire in Helen's stove, and his amber eyes remained fixed on every sound beyond the door. Though only 6, Ranger's body carried the weight of vigilance. The faint notches in his ears suggested he had endured hardships before, perhaps fights with stray dogs or the rough hand of neglect. Yet his temperament was steady, watchful, loyal, and willing to bare his teeth if the child shifted into danger. Helen moved about the kitchen, her sturdy frame bent slightly as she kneaded dough. She hummed faintly, a tune from long ago, trying to create an illusion of normalcy for the girl. Her hands shook at times, not from age alone, but from regret that had settled into her bones. Ethan knew it was her way of coping, offering food, offering warmth, when she could not offer an undoing of the past. Detective Sarah Mitchell entered with a file in her hand, the navy of her coat brushing against the doorframe. She looked taller in the morning light, her green eyes sharper, a spark of resolve burning in their depths. Sarah carried herself like someone who had long ago decided that her grief would never be wasted. It would be used. Her gaze swept the room and then rested on Ethan. "I pulled Caleb Brooks's employment records and background," she said. "There's a pattern." She spread the documents across the table. Caleb Brooks, 38, once a foreman at a local construction company, dismissed after repeated altercations with co-workers. Witness statements described him as short-tempered, a broad man with thick shoulders and a face weathered by drink. He had been seen at bars more frequently after losing his job, his sandy brown hair often unkempt, his blue eyes clouded with resentment. One neighbor's testimony recorded him smashing a car window after an argument. Another mentioned how he grew more reclusive, shutting Linda and Lila inside. Sarah tapped the papers with one long finger. Every time he lost control, he pulled further from the community. 3 months ago, he stopped showing up at his usual haunts altogether. The last sighting was a gas station on Route 12. He bought a tank of fuel and drove east. Deputy Mark Hensley, who had joined them after speaking with State Patrol, leaned against the wall, his arms folded. His square frame filled the doorway, but his posture betrayed unease. If he's running, he's not running blind. He's got family 2 counties over. An older cousin works on an oil rig. We've sent inquiries. Mark's brown eyes shifted, guilt flickering there. He had grown up with men like Caleb, hard men who turned inward when life soured, who struck out rather than sought help. Helen's brow furrowed deeply. So he left her, left Lila, knowing what he'd done? Her voice trembled with disbelief and shame. Ethan placed a hand gently on her arm. That's what cowards do. While the adults spoke, Lila sat quietly, tracing her fingers through Ranger's fur. She looked smaller in the chair, her eyes shadowed but listening to every word. Finally, she whispered, "Daddy said he had to go away. He told me to be good, but Mama never said goodbye." Her words cut the room into silence. Ranger lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against her sweater, a low rumble in his chest as if echoing her grief. Sarah crouched beside the girl, her tall figure folding gracefully. "Lila, your mama loved you. She didn't leave you. Something very bad happened, and none of it is your fault." She looked into the child's brown eyes, the same eyes Linda had carried, and her voice softened further. "We're going to make sure you're safe now." The kitchen filled with the aroma of Helen's bread baking, a domestic scene that contrasted bitterly with the files scattered across the table. Ethan stared at the documents, his mind drifting back to his own father. Another man destroyed by drink. Another man who had vanished one night without ever returning. For years, Ethan had wished him gone, but the wound of abandonment still bled quietly. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay present. This wasn't about his ghosts. It was about hers. Frank Donnelly arrived midway through the morning, his forensic kit slung over one broad shoulder. His square face looked even grimmer than usual. "We cataloged everything beneath those boards," he reported. "Blood, hair, fragments of fabric. Enough to confirm probable homicide. But the body—" He paused, clearing his throat. "It's buried deeper. We'll have to excavate the foundation with heavy equipment. That starts tomorrow." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan glanced at Lila again, but Helen swiftly ushered her into the parlor to play with Ranger, shielding her ears. Sarah rubbed her temples, fatigue visible even in the rigid lines of her posture. "He thought he could bury his sins under wooden nails," she muttered, "but the truth always rises." As the adults discussed, "Logistics!" Ethan stepped into the parlor. Ranger was sprawled across the rug, Lila curled against his side. She had arranged Helen's old wooden blocks into a small house, carefully stacking them while whispering to the dog. Ethan lowered himself to the floor, his tall frame folding awkwardly. "That's a fine house," he said gently. Lila shrugged. "It's not broken." Her small fingers tightened around a block before placing it carefully at the roof. Ranger nudged it with his nose as if approving. Ethan felt the heaviness in his chest ease slightly. This child still held a spark, fragile but alive. He vowed to protect it. Later that afternoon, Sarah received a call. She stepped onto the porch, her long frame taut as she listened. When she returned, her face was set in stone. State Patrol picked up Caleb's car outside a motel 2 towns over. The vehicle was abandoned, no sign of him. Mark cursed under his breath. Frank adjusted his bag and shook his head. Ethan met Sarah's eyes. "He's running scared." Sarah nodded. "And scared men are dangerous." As twilight fell once more over Willow Creek, Helen tucked a blanket around Lila, who had dozed off against Ranger's warm body. The dog's amber eyes stayed open, ever the sentinel. Ethan stood at the window, the sky darkening behind his reflection. Caleb Brooks was gone, but his shadow remained, and until he was found, that shadow would haunt them all. The morning broke over Willow Creek with a reluctant sun. its pale rays barely piercing through the heavy clouds that hung low over the town. The air smelled of damp soil and rust, and the mist clung stubbornly to the roofs, like secrets unwilling to lift. A small crowd had gathered along the street, neighbors murmuring in hushed tones as uniformed officers moved purposefully around the Brooks house. Yellow tape flapped in the wind, warning the curious to keep their distance, yet no one seemed able to turn away. Inside, the house no longer felt like a home. The living room, stripped of its furniture and worn rugs, looked skeletal. Boards had been pried away, exposing a dark cavity beneath. The air was thick with dust and mildew, and each creak of the old house seemed like a groan of protest against the truth about to surface. Ethan Rose stood near the opening, his broad frame silhouetted against the dim light. He looked older than his 35 years, fatigue dragging down his features. His hazel eyes were fixed on the workers, preparing to dig deeper into the foundation, though his thoughts strayed to the child across the street. Helen Winters had insisted on keeping Lila at her home while the excavation took place. The girl, still fragile, now clung even more tightly to Ranger, who had become her anchor. Helen's parlor, with its floral wallpaper and the scent of cinnamon tea, had been transformed into a refuge. Lila sat curled in a rocking chair, her small legs tucked beneath a blanket. Ranger stretched faithfully at her feet. His amber eyes flicked toward every sound, ears pricking at the passing of footsteps outside. Helen, bustling around with her short, sturdy frame, tried to distract the child with baking, pulling trays of sugar cookies from the oven, though her hands shook with every tray she set down. Back at the Brooks residence, Sarah Mitchell crouched beside the excavation team. Her tall, lean figure was bundled into a heavy coat, the collar turned up against the chill. Her green eyes, sharp even in fatigue, scanned the work with precision. Sarah carried a clipboard in one gloved hand, jotting notes with the calm discipline of someone who had lived through chaos enough times to know structure was the only thing that kept one steady. Her past grief, her younger sister's death years ago, burned quietly in her veins, but it manifested now as fuel, a force that gave her voice strength as she instructed the workers. The crew was led by Gregory "Greg" Sandoval, a contractor in his mid-40s, enlisted for his expertise in careful excavation of old houses. Greg was tall and barrel-chested, with thick dark hair streaked with gray and hands calloused from years of manual labor. His face, sun-weathered, bore the permanent squint of a man accustomed to outdoor work. Though rough in appearance, Greg was patient and methodical, speaking in a low baritone that carried reassurance. He guided his men with the precision of someone who had built more homes than he could count, though dismantling one for evidence weighed visibly on him. As the digging progressed, silence fell heavier in the room. Every scrape of a shovel, every clink of displaced stone echoed like a tolling bell. Ethan folded his arms, his jaw tight, the muscles in his neck corded with restraint. He had faced crime scenes before, but never one that clawed so close to his own scars. Then, a sound, a hollow thud, changed the air. Greg's men froze, glancing up at him. Sarah stepped forward, her sharp green eyes narrowing. "Slowly," she instructed, her voice measured. The men brushed aside layers of soil, the odor of decay rising faintly. Ethan's breath caught. Beneath the packed earth, fragments of fabric appeared, tattered and discolored, clinging to what remained of human form. The auburn strands of hair were unmistakable. Sarah's gloved hand tightened around her pen. Frank Donnelly, the forensic technician, moved forward with bags and instruments, his square frame bent low, his weathered face grim. "We have her," he said, his voice roughened by years of facing such truths. He began the delicate process of documenting, photographing, and recovering evidence. Outside, word traveled quickly. Neighbors shifted uneasily, some weeping softly, others whispering in guilt about the nights they had heard shouting and done nothing. The town of Willow Creek, so small and so tightly woven, now felt the sting of collective silence. Ethan turned away, stepping out onto the porch, his breath fogging in the cold air. Across the street, through Helen's lace curtains, he could see Lila's small silhouette against the glow of the fireplace. Ranger's form was pressed close to her, unmoving, as though the dog sensed the moment. Ethan's heart clenched. He would have to tell her, and he dreaded it. Back inside, Sarah finished her notes, her tall frame unfolding as she rose. She glanced at Ethan, her expression taut but steady. "We'll confirm with dental records, but it's her," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once, unable to speak. His hazel eyes hardened with a promise instead. Later that afternoon, Ethan crossed the street to Helen's home. The warmth of her kitchen hit him like a wave, the scent of cinnamon mingling with wood smoke. Helen looked up, her lined face etched with sorrow. "She's been asking," she whispered, "but I couldn't." She gestured helplessly toward the parlor. Lila sat in the rocking chair, her cardigan slipping from one shoulder, her eyes heavy with unspoken fear. Ranger lay at her side, his muzzle resting across her feet. When Ethan knelt beside her, the dog's amber eyes locked onto his as if demanding honesty. Ethan drew in a slow breath. "Lila," he said softly, "we found your mama. She can't wake up anymore, but she loved you more than anything, and that love is still here, with you." The girl's lips quivered. She pressed her face into Ranger's fur, clutching him so tightly her knuckles whitened. Ranger endured it silently, a steady heartbeat against her trembling frame. Ethan rested a hand lightly on her shoulder, the words catching in his throat. He had promised he wouldn't leave her, and he wouldn't. That evening, as darkness swallowed the town, candles flickered in windows up and down Maple Street. Neighbors who had once remained silent now bowed their heads in remorse. In Helen's kitchen, Ethan, Sarah, and Helen sat together, the silence between them heavier than words. Outside, Ranger lifted his head at the sound of distant church bells, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight, as if to remind them all that though the truth was cruel, the girl he guarded would not walk alone. Winter's breath had settled over Willow Creek by the time the case of Caleb Brooks reached the courthouse. The sky above was a dull pewter, and the wind carried sharp flakes of snow that rattled against the windows like impatient fingers. The town, still mourning the truth uncovered beneath the Brooks floorboards, now turned its eyes toward justice. The courthouse, a stone building that had once been the pride of the county, loomed against the gray morning with its pillars dusted in frost. People gathered on the steps, clutching coats tight around them, their whispers clouding in the air. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. Ethan Rowe sat at the front, his broad shoulders squared in his Navy uniform, though exhaustion weighed in the set of his jaw. His hazel eyes remained focused, determined to see this through for Lila. He had carried her into this storm, and he intended to stand guard until the very end. At his side, Ranger sat upright, his black and silver coat gleaming under the dull courtroom lights. The German shepherd was freshly groomed, but his amber eyes carried the same fierce alertness as always. He was no longer just a pet in the eyes of the town. He was seen as a guardian who had held Lila's fragile world together. Lila herself sat 2 rows behind Ethan, close to Helen Winters. The girl's cardigan had been replaced with a modest dress in pale blue, her hair brushed neatly into soft braids. She looked small against the long wooden bench, her hands clutching a small knitted scarf Helen had made for her. Her brown eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, but every time they landed on Ranger's steady form, she calmed. Helen, her sturdy frame wrapped in a gray wool coat, placed a steadying hand on the girl's back. "You're safe, love," she whispered, her silver hair glowing in the light. Detective Sarah Mitchell entered next, her tall, lean frame wrapped in a black trench coat, her sharp green eyes betraying no hesitation. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm, filled with notes and reports meticulously prepared. Sarah had changed since the investigation began. She carried herself now with more fire, as though Linda's case was not just about one woman lost, but about reclaiming every voice silenced by fear. The grief of her sister's death still haunted her, but it had transformed into a sharpened blade of purpose. At the prosecution table sat Assistant District Attorney Claire Benton, a woman in her late 30s with sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled tightly into a bun, and a gaze that could slice through pretense. Claire had built her reputation on domestic violence cases. She dressed simply in a charcoal suit, her tall figure always upright, and her manner of speaking was precise, deliberate, honed from years of convincing juries to believe the stories victims could no longer tell. She had once been a victim herself. Her father, a man with fists quicker than apologies had shaped her childhood. It was that scar which had driven her into the law. Across from her sat the defense attorney, Richard Lowe, a man in his mid-40s with thinning blonde hair and spectacles perched precariously on his nose. His suit was well-tailored, but looked stiff on his lanky frame. Richard was known for his courtroom eloquence, though whispers in town suggested his motives were often driven more by paycheck than principle. He wore a professional mask, but his eyes shifted uneasily whenever Caleb glanced his way. And Caleb Brooks, he sat shackled at the defense table, his sandy brown hair unkempt, his once broad shoulders slouched. His blue eyes, bloodshot and sullen, carried neither remorse nor pride. He looked diminished, as though the weight of exposure had ground him down. Yet his jaw still clenched with defiance, and the faint sneer he carried whenever Lila entered the room spoke volumes of the man he was. The trial opened with testimony from the forensic team. Frank Donnelly, sturdy and methodical, described the process of uncovering Linda's body and the evidence collected: blood patterns, hair strands, fabric fragments. His voice was steady, though his square face tightened when he spoke of the depth of the concealment. The jurors, 12 men and women from across the county, leaned forward, expressions solemn. Helen Winters was called next. She walked to the stand slowly, her sturdy figure wrapped in dignity, despite the tremble in her hands. Her silver hair framed a face lined with both kindness and regret. Helen spoke softly, recounting nights when she had heard shouting, when she had offered cookies to a frightened child instead of calling for help. Her voice cracked when she admitted, "I should have done more." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Her words carried both shame and truth that weighed on the community. Then came the moment Ethan had dreaded, Lila's testimony. She was led gently to the stand by a court-appointed advocate, Melissa Carter, a woman in her 40s with auburn hair tied in a loose bun and a warm, round face. Melissa was a child psychologist, tall and soft-spoken, whose calm presence had helped many children through trauma. She wore a simple navy dress, her manner patient and careful, her brown eyes steady on Lila as she guided her into the chair. Ranger was permitted to accompany Lila, lying at her feet as she took her seat. The dog's presence filled the room with quiet strength. Lila's small hands clutched the scarf Helen had given her as she answered the questions in a voice that trembled but did not break. She spoke of her father yelling, of nights when Ranger pressed against her to shield her from the noise, of the day she called 911 and whispered, "He put Mama under the floor." Her words, innocent yet devastating, drew tears from the gallery. Claire Benton's questioning was gentle, guiding, never pressing too far. The defense tried to shake her, with Richard Lowe suggesting perhaps she misunderstood, that her memories were shaped by fear. But Lila's gaze never wavered when she said, "I saw the nails. I heard Mama stop breathing. Daddy said she needed a long sleep." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words undeniable. Ranger lifted his head, amber eyes blazing, and rested his chin on her lap. The jurors shifted, some visibly moved. By the afternoon, the trial had drawn to a somber rhythm of testimony and rebuttal. Sarah took the stand, her tall frame commanding, her voice calm but charged. She outlined the investigative process, the history of Caleb's temper, the pattern of his behavior that fit the profile of abusers she had studied for years. Her green eyes locked on the jury as she said, "This was not an accident, this was escalation, a chain of violence that ended in silence." When the court adjourned for the day, Ethan walked with Lila and Helen down the courthouse steps. Snowflakes drifted gently, settling on Lila's braids. She clutched Ranger's leash, her small hand buried in the thick fur at his neck. Ethan looked down at her, his hazel eyes softening. "You were braver than anyone in there," he said quietly. Helen dabbed at her eyes, whispering, "Your mama would be proud." And for the first time since the nightmare began, Lila gave a small, tired smile. Ranger wagged his tail faintly, his silent vow of protection as steadfast as ever. The verdict was delivered on a crisp December morning when the courthouse steps were lined with townsfolk clutching scarves and steaming cups of coffee. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the pale sky, settling on coats and hair, melting as quickly as they landed. Inside, the jury foreman read aloud the words that reverberated through the chamber. Guilty on all counts. Caleb Brooks lowered his head, his once broad shoulders sagging, the last glimmer of defiance extinguished in his tired blue eyes. Chains clinked softly as marshals led him away. Ethan Rowe, standing near the front, let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't triumph. It was relief, tempered with the weight of what had been lost. Lila sat between Helen Winters and Detective Sarah Mitchell, her small hands clutched tightly around Ranger's leash. The German shepherd, freshly brushed, sat tall at her feet, his black and silver coat shining under the fluorescent lights. His amber eyes followed Caleb until the man disappeared behind the heavy doors. For the first time, Lila's lips curved into a fragile smile, a smile not born of joy, but of release. Helen, her silver hair tucked under a knitted hat, pressed a tissue to her eyes. "It's over now, love," she whispered, though her voice trembled. After the trial, Willow Creek shifted. The town that had once whispered behind closed doors now held public forums, neighbors finally speaking aloud about violence they had ignored. At the center of these gatherings was the proposal for a community center in Linda Brooks's name, a place for women and children to seek refuge, for neighbors to find training on intervention, for silence to no longer be an option. The initiative was spearheaded by Mayor Thomas Kincaid, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a commanding presence softened by a warm baritone voice. Tall and barrel-chested, he was known for his fairness, though some said he was cautious to a fault. The events surrounding Linda's death had shaken him. He had grown up with Caleb and remembered a boy full of charm who had soured into a man consumed by rage. Mayor Kincaid saw the center not only as restitution for the town, but as penance for the years he had chosen not to see. The dedication ceremony was held just after Christmas, on a day when sunlight bounced off fresh snow and made the town square gleam. A simple brick building that had once been an unused library had been renovated into the Linda Brooks Family Resource Center. Its windows glowed with warm light, and the entry was adorned with wreaths of evergreen and purple ribbons, the color of Lila's old dress. Ethan stood among the crowd, his tall frame wrapped in a navy winter coat, his breath visible in the frosty air. He watched as Helen guided Lila up the steps. The child wore a red wool coat with buttons too large for her hands, her brown eyes wide as she clutched Ranger's leash. Ranger, steady as ever, padded beside her, his fur dusted with snowflakes. The dog seemed to sense the importance of the day, his posture proud, tail swaying gently with each step. Mayor Kincaid spoke at the podium, his voice carrying across the square. He spoke not just of Linda's memory, but of the courage of her daughter, who had spoken when others had been silent. He promised that the center would ensure no other voice would be ignored in Willow Creek again. The crowd listened intently, their faces solemn, some weeping quietly. After the ceremony, Lila was given a tour of the new center. Inside, the building smelled faintly of fresh paint and pine wood. Bright murals covered the walls, painted by local volunteers. Scenes of families together, of children playing safely in parks. In the reading room, books filled the shelves, their spines gleaming under soft lamplight. In the kitchen, a woman ladled soup into steaming bowls for visitors. Her name was Patricia Gomez, a volunteer in her early 50s, short and round, with a kind face and streaks of gray in her dark hair. She greeted Lila with a wide smile and slipped her a cookie, her laughter gentle, as if to reassure the girl that this was a place of warmth. Helen watched all of it with tears in her eyes. The sturdy widow who had once been paralyzed by guilt now found herself stepping into a new role, a guardian not only to Lila, but to a mission larger than herself. When social services reviewed the case, Helen applied to become Lila's permanent guardian. The process was thorough. Home inspections, interviews, but Ethan, Sarah, and even Mayor Kincaid wrote letters of support. Each described Helen's compassion, her stability, and the way Lila's laughter had begun to return within her care. The final approval came in late January. Ethan drove to Helen's house that evening, snow crunching under his boots as he stepped onto the porch. Inside, he found Lila sitting on the rug, building another house from wooden blocks. Ranger lay across her lap, his tail thumping slowly as she worked. Ethan crouched down, his hazel eyes warm. "Guess what?" he said gently. "The judge signed the papers today. It's official. You get to stay here with Grandma Helen and Ranger. This is your home now." Lila's brown eyes widened. She looked at Helen, then at Ranger, then back at Ethan. "Really?" Her voice was a whisper of disbelief. Helen, tears spilling down her wrinkled cheeks, pulled the child into her arms. "Really, love. You're ours now." Ranger barked once, sharp and joyful, as though sealing the promise. Lila buried her face in his fur, giggling through her tears. For the first time since Ethan had met her, her smile lit her whole face. That night, as the fire crackled in Helen's hearth, the three of them, Helen, Lila, and Ethan, sat together while Ranger sprawled across the rug. Sarah visited too, leaning her tall frame against the doorway, her green eyes soft. She rarely allowed herself to relax, but here she permitted a faint smile. They spoke of the center, of how the town was changing, and of the small victories that could grow into something lasting. Lila fell asleep against Helen's lap. Ranger curled protectively around her. Ethan watched them, his chest heavy but full. The storm had not left them untouched, but a new foundation had been laid, one built not of silence and fear, but of hope, of guardianship, and of the steadfast love of a dog who had never once left her side. Spring returned to Willow Creek with hesitant warmth, the snow finally retreating into the soil and leaving behind patches of green that stretched timidly across the hills. The town, though still marked by the shadows of the Brooks tragedy, now wore its scars like lessons carved into its skin. The Linda Brooks Family Resource Center bustled with life. Children played in its brightly painted rooms. Women sought counsel within its walls, and neighbors stopped by to volunteer where once they would have looked away. For Lila Brooks, life had settled into something gentler. Months had passed since the trial, and the little girl who once sat trembling on creaking floorboards was now discovering what it meant to laugh again. Helen Winters' home had become hers, its floral curtains, its faint smell of cinnamon and lavender, and its tidy garden in the back. There, Helen had planted rows of purple flowers in Linda's memory, their petals swaying like whispers of resilience. On a cool April morning, Lila knelt in the garden with Ranger at her side. She wore a yellow dress dotted with daisies, her braids tied with mismatched ribbons Helen had found in an old sewing box. Her brown eyes, though still carrying shadows, now held a sparkle when the sun touched them. She dug into the soil with her small hands, carefully pressing a new plant into the earth. Ranger, older now, stretched nearby. His black and silver coat had begun to dull at the edges, streaked faintly with white around the muzzle. At 7 years old, he was still strong, but his movements were slower, more deliberate. Yet his amber eyes remained sharp, tracking every sound as if his oath of guardianship had never weakened. Ethan Rowe leaned against the wooden fence, watching with a faint smile. He had traded his Navy uniform for a simple plaid shirt and jeans on his day off, though his broad shoulders and steady posture carried the same authority. His hazel eyes softened when he saw Lila pat Ranger's back with muddy hands. For months he had visited regularly, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes simply walking Lila to the school bus. The girl had begun to call him Uncle Ethan, a name that warmed something deep inside him he hadn't realized still ached. Sarah Mitchell arrived moments later, tall and graceful as ever, her chestnut hair tied back loosely, a navy scarf wrapped around her long neck. She carried a basket of seedlings under one arm, her green eyes bright despite the fatigue that never seemed to leave her. Since the trial, Sarah had spearheaded new training programs at the center. Her reputation had grown. Colleagues now called her unyielding, though the townsfolk saw the compassion that softened her tall frame whenever she bent to speak to a child. She had lost her sister once, but she had promised herself never to let another girl slip through the cracks of silence. "Morning," Sarah greeted, crouching to place the basket beside Lila. "These are for you. Thought you might like to add them to the garden." Lila's face lit up, her brown eyes widening. "Purple, like Mama's flowers?" Sarah nodded, her tall frame folding gracefully as she knelt beside the girl. "Exactly like that." Ranger barked once, tail sweeping slowly across the grass. Later that afternoon, Helen joined them in the garden, her sturdy frame bundled in a light cardigan, her silver hair pinned neatly. She watched Lila dig and laughed softly. "She's taken to gardening better than I ever did." Helen had changed since those first dark nights. The guilt that once weighed on her seemed to have transmuted into purpose. She spent hours at the center, baking for visitors, mentoring young mothers, and reminding anyone who would listen that silence was never protection. As the sun dipped lower, a new figure approached from the street. Reverend Samuel Price, the town's pastor, tall and thin, with a kind face and thinning blonde hair, carried a watering can and a Bible tucked under his arm. In his early 60s, Reverend Price was known for his calm voice and for spending as much time in gardens and kitchens as in the pulpit. He had officiated Linda's memorial and had since made a point of visiting Helen and Lila often. He greeted them with a soft smile. "I thought these flowers could use a blessing," he said warmly. Lila grinned shyly and nodded. Together, they stood in the garden as the Reverend offered gentle words, his voice steady against the rustling of the spring breeze. Lila bent down and placed a small bouquet of purple blossoms at the foot of the stone marker Helen had set at the garden's edge. The marker read simply, "In loving memory of Linda Brooks." Ethan placed a hand on Lila's shoulder. "Your bravery changed this town," he said softly. His hazel eyes held pride, not just in the child, but in the resilience she had awakened in all of them. Lila looked up, her lips trembling into a smile. "Mama would be proud, and Ranger too." She bent down to kiss the top of the old dog's head. Ranger thumped his tail once, closing his amber eyes as though content. As twilight fell, the garden glowed with lanterns Helen had strung along the fence. Neighbors gathered, bringing food, laughter, and quiet tears. The town that had once turned away now stood together. Sarah leaned against the gate, her tall frame silhouetted against the lantern light, her green eyes reflecting something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Helen bustled with trays of cookies. Reverend Price told stories to children gathered at his knees, and Ethan laughed quietly at a joke told by Mark Hensley, the deputy who had once looked so uneasy and now stood with more confidence. At the center of it all was Lila, kneeling in the dirt with Ranger pressed against her side, her hands covered in soil and her hair tumbling from its braids. She looked up at the lanterns, the flowers, and the circle of people who had become her family. For the first time, she felt not just safe, but rooted, planted in a soil of love, community, and unwavering guardianship. The garden of purple flowers swayed in the spring breeze, a living testament to survival and transformation. Willow Creek had changed, but so had Lila. And as Ranger rested at her side, his muzzle graying but his spirit unbroken, she knew she would never again be alone. In this story, we witnessed how a child's courage, a loyal German shepherd's devotion, and a community's awakening became a reminder that even in the darkest places, God's light can shine through. It is a miracle that when love and faith are chosen, healing begins. In our daily lives, we are often faced with moments where silence feels easier, but God calls us to act, to protect, and to love without fear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others, leave a comment, and subscribe for more. May God bless you and your family with strength and peace. And if you believe that His miracles are still at work today, write Amen in the comments.